the study of Luther and Lutheranism, but the topic today is what happened in Germany after the beginning of Luther's revolution, and that is known in history as the German Peasant War, or Peasant War in Germany, or simply Civil War in Germany. So essentially the events that followed the widespread teaching of Luther. So a little bit more about Germany. Now that is no good. I'll have to cut it out and you better shut up and be quiet, okay? So context of Luther in Germany. We spoke a lot about Italy, not much about Germany. Germany had a very developed infrastructure of roads, universities, printing presses, students, landlords, townships. So it was pretty much like Italy in many ways. But the difference was that it resented, now, okay, again, what is going on over there? Why you keep talking? It had, like Italy, it had independent towns who elected their assemblies, and it had legally defined relationships with the landlords. The landlords were pretty much independent, like in Italy, even though they had an emperor. Theoretically, there was an overlord, an emperor, who was Charles V, or Don Carlos, or the red-haired young boy of Habsburg origin, who simultaneously was the king of Spain. So that means he was a lot of times in Spain or in what today is known as Belgium, and not so much in Germany, and therefore there was a lot of autonomy by the German princes. And they had their own laws and their own tolls and their own currencies, and Germany remained pretty much decentralized into the 19th century. So this is the context. So in other words, there was no one unified German state, but neither there was an Italian one. And the only one that was centralized at that time was France and more or less Spain. But Germany and Italy were very similar in terms of principalities that were quite autonomous in their way of life and economic life and government and so forth. So it is in this context. Now, what happens, of course, in Germany is very different than in Italy because Luther's teaching just flared up. And this is an example of something that happened that nobody anticipated would happen, least of all Luther. So essentially what happened, people began to follow up on these ideas. And his ideas, they interpreted it in their own way. And this is so interesting an example. When people take somebody's idea and begin to act on it the way they understand it, and then the author, in this case Luther, would be in total, not only surprised, but flabbergasted. What are they doing with my ideas? Sort of similar to Marx and Lenin, what Lenin did. Marx probably would have been very, very upset that it was done in his name. So, what happened? What happened was essentially a revolution. It was a revolution that sort of escalated from stage to stage. And at first, it was the first stage was people began to desecrate the churches because Luther told them that all these relics are useless, that you have direct communication with God, you don't need no priest, you don't need no pope, pope is a prostitute, you don't need any authority, you just basically by faith alone. And people actually began to act on this premise. So basically what was formed, there are all kinds of councils and committees and leaders were formed. One of them was, the most famous one was Münzer, and they essentially created in various towns, various assemblies, and wrote a declaration that many towns actually read aloud and signed for it and began practicing this declaration. And it had 12 points. So I'll quote you some of them. And you will see what an incredible reading of Luther that is. That all the townships, one of the points said, should have an assembly elected by the universal suffrage. I mean, that's not 20th century, that's 1525. And here's a political demand for universal suffrage because all Christians are brothers. Then the next demands there should be no tolls and no duties paid to the landlord because that's unfair, because all people are born to be equal Christians before God. So why is it that I have to pay to somebody tolls and dues? Then the next demand is that there should be no Roman law anymore. There should be a German law and not the Roman law in Latin that comes from the Pope. There shouldn't be any tenth that is paid to the church or the landlord. And finally, there should be a Bible that is taught only the way Luther told that it should be told. In some of the places, there were obviously the kind of demands that went beyond what Luther wanted or meant. And these were communist type demands to eliminate all the property and to have it in common. Mills actually went to such an extent, it was really kind of funny because in a sense, one of the demands was extermination of the godless. And by the godless, they meant the Catholics, the priests, those who defend the Pope. Extermination, I mean physically, just shoot them, kill them, and destroy them. That is the thing. They also talked about all things that should be held in common property and extermination of the capitalists. That would be communist. But exterminate the godless and all held in common, that's in a resolution by Münzer in 1525. So you see how far this spread. Now, Luther's reaction was, at first, he was in panic. At first, Luther was preoccupied with saving his soul. He's very self-centered, actually. He didn't think what would happen if people believed what he was saying. And people did believe and begin to act, and he was in total panic. He didn't know what to do. And he started writing pamphlets basically saying, this must, I quote, this must result in ruin, destruction, and desolation of Germany, murder and bloodshed. So he cautions them. He writes pamphlets which of course are published. They're pretty much like a lively press, that pamphlets are shared by people all over. And he tried to reason both with the nobles and with the peasants to just hold off, just hold off. What is going on at this stage of the revolution is that all over Germany you have unbelievable, what we would today call civic activity. There are council meetings, there are resolutions passed, that the townspeople demand all kinds of things from the landlords. The peasants come to the townships and just fraternize them and pass resolutions. And many times the landlords do listen. And some of them are so scared by this revolt that they actually sign in and agree to some of the demands so that they could have peace. In some cases, they even celebrate victory together and throw out the relics from the churches together. But the interesting thing about Luther is fewer and fewer people are actually listening to him and his admonitions. And then the revolution goes to a higher stage, and that means basically from passing resolutions, you go on to action. And that is one, this is what is going on. Choose among nobles and lords from the city's councilmen and have them settle in a peaceful way, writes Luther. Give up a little bit of your tyranny and oppression so that the people get an air and room to live. So this is his admonitions to the landlords, to the lords who saved his skin. He calls it, ease up on your tyranny. So he kind of is talking the revolutionary language here. So ease up on your tyranny is reduce the taxes. He's still seeking of a peaceful outcome of this, and increasingly he's kind of like abandoned by the masses. I'm sorry, I wrote a book about the Mensheviks and the Russian Revolution. Luther reminds me of the Mensheviks or the provisional government when they're slowly losing the support of the people, and less people are listening to them, and more people are speaking to the radicals. In Russian Revolution case, to the communists, but in this case to the extreme leaders, who basically says, let's go get them, and destroy the churches and throw out the priests. So many of them turn away from Luther, just like they turn away from the provisional government in Russia, and they call him not Luther but Lügner. Lügner in German means liar. So it sort of rhymes, Luther, the Lügner, in German it rhymes, and that's sort of very insulting. Then it pisses him off. He's very upset, and increasingly he's turning against the revolutionaries, against the peasants. And then he basically says the following: it would be better for salvation of the soul that the lands were not so rich and their possession divided among the poor. So that quote suggests that he's trying to seek favor with the leaders of the revolution. He's saying the poor should be getting a little bit more. He's trying to stay on top of things. He's trying to remain the leader, but increasingly, he's losing it. So at this stage of the revolution, the townships drive out the princes and the dukes and their overlords, and they begin to desecrate the churches, which means they throw out the relics and destroy the icons, and they just basically, sometimes they destroy everything and throw out the priests altogether. A lot of times, local priests in the small villages, they join with the protesters, and they actually lead them against the representatives of the Pope. So you have all kinds of combinations that you could have: landlords with them, landlords accepting them, landlords not accepting them. There's essentially, Germany is in turmoil, unleashed by Luther's preaching. Okay. So here's another quote from Luther. If the intentions of the peasants had been carried out, no honest man would have been saved from them, but whoever had a penny more than another would have had to suffer for it. They had already begun that, and they would not have stopped there. Women and children would have been put to shame, and they would have taken to killing one after another, and there would have been no peace, no safety anymore. In this pamphlet, you could see that Luther is turning against the revolution. He's getting scared. He's seeking the support of the dukes and landlords, and he's very much afraid that if he loses that support, he's finished. Because the Catholics would not forgive him what he had done. So he's basically stopping the admonitions to tone down the exploitation, and is increasingly turning against the revolutionaries and against the peasant leaders. In the meantime, peasant bands are roaming around. This would be something that later on Schiller would write, his famous play, The Robbers. Germany is full of robbers. Germany is full of forests, and in these forests, bands of peasants are roaming around the countryside. Can't resist the comparison. Same thing happened in Russia in 1918, 1920, when the peasant bands were going around the countryside, robbing just about anybody, including the communist commissar authorities. So this is the time when you have massive destruction of the churches, you have robberies, you have murders, you have essentially fear, terrorism in a sense. The bishops are terrified, and some of them agree to sign and begin to plot against the revolutionaries. In May 1525, Luther writes a pamphlet, which is also quite well known, where he turns completely against the revolution, and it's called Against the Robbing and the Murdering Hordes of Peasants. And so now he's talking about the mad dogs that have to be destroyed at first opportunity. And he calls to mercilessly hunt down the rebels. And he also begins to explain that they didn't understand what he meant by salvation of the soul. He says very clearly, gospel, which means the Bible, does not make goods common. So very clear assertion, he's not a communist, and he does not want to be understood that property should be divided in common. There's nothing like that. He said when Jesus divided up the bread, that didn't mean that there would be no private property. So he begins to interpret the Bible in terms of favorable to the landlords and their sacred property. So Luther shows that he is with the princes, with the dukes, that he is with the property of the rich. He abandons all the preaching about tightening up the tyranny, and he is for the church as an institution. He is just against the Pope. He is just against the Catholic Church, not against the church as an institution. Church is necessary. Church is useful. It's just going to be a different church. So here you have the beginnings of what will be the Lutheran Church. It would be a church, but it's going to be a Lutheran church. Finally, there's a battle. Again, all of that in 1525, near the town of Mühlhausen. And you have the assembly of German princes with 8,000 men and artillery. This is the time when guns are pretty much used already in a serious way. And then the rebel army of peasants led by Münzer comes over there, and they're slaughtered and massacred with artillery fire and with the musket fire, as 5,000 of them are dead on the spot in that one so-called battle, which is more like a mass execution of rebels. And then the massacres continue all over Germany. Essentially, the landlords take their revenge, and they hunt down these robbers and anybody who had anything to do with Münzer and his declarations and things. They essentially, it's kind of like, in the analogy of the Russian Revolution, it would be a white terror. Essentially, the property-owning classes set their scores with the revolutionaries and hunt them down and exterminate them. So the official calculation is that Germany lost 130,000 peasants who were killed in these escalating violence during the Peasant War. Officially, 10,000 ringleaders were executed by courts in Germany, 10,000 after the event. 50,000 were homeless, basically continuing to run around Germany in the forests and continuing the brigands and the Robin Hood type activity of seizing from the rich and giving it to the poor. Luther lost all credibility. Luther essentially is no more. The rich don't trust him. The Catholic Church hates him. The masses don't like him anymore. Essentially, from that time on, and he's going to live a long time, he basically lost all support that he had, and he basically had to write his books and sit there and translate his Bible, and nobody cared anymore. And little by little, 20 years later, the people around him begin to organize what would be known as the Lutheran Church. Order was restored, but nothing was the same in Germany anymore. To the present day, the consequences of that Peasant War can be felt. Germany is divided into two from that time on. Germany in the north is Protestant, which means Lutheran. Germany in the south is Catholic, which means Catholic. There are some towns in between, and there would be escalation of violence on and off. However, this particular episode finished in a peace treaty, which is known as the Peace of Augsburg, 1550, which is very, very important because it put an end to religious war in Germany for the next 100 years. The Peace of Augsburg basically was an agreement of the landlords, of the dukes and herzogs and others, that religion would be decided by the owner, by the landlord. If the landlord wants to be Protestant, all the people in this principality would have to be Protestant. If he chooses to be Catholic, then they all will have to be Catholic. If you don't like that, move, get out. go to the Catholic place, or else convert and be what your Lord tells you what to be. So this was no more a choice of your personal choosing, as it would be in France for some time before they exterminate all of them. But it was decided by the landlords, and that's pretty much how it was. The only good thing about it is that civil war stopped. There was actually no war in Germany until, as I said, the 30 Years' War in 1630s. So that's the outcome of teaching by Martin Luther. Thank you.